first like to acknowledge the co-authors on this work, Jeff Hickey, Haganush Preisler, who's Forest Service statistician, and Ken Raffa at the University of Wisconsin. And this, I'll be talking about trying to understand the influence of climate on mountain pine beetle outbreaks in whitebark pine forests across the West. For those of you who don't know or aren't familiar with whitebark, it's a keystone species in the high elevation forests. It can survive in really cold and arid climate conditions, and then it provides shelter for other conifers to establish. It's a very slow-growing species and allocates much of its resources to producing very high-energy cones. These are an important food resource for grizzly bears and Clark's nutcrackers, among other species. Because it's slow-growing, it's often outcompeted by spruce and fir and lodgepole pine, so it does occur at lower elevations, but not very commonly. Across much of its range, it has been experiencing decline due to three primary things. One is fire exclusion, and that promotes the development and establishment of subalpine fir, an introduced pathogen that causes white pine blister rust, and attacks from the native mountain pine beetle. So it was petitioned to be listed under the Endangered Species Act, and in 2011, the Fish and Wildlife Service decided it was listed as warranted, but precluded due to a lack of agency funding. Beginning in about the early 2000s, there were extensive mountain pine beetle outbreaks in whitebark pine, shown here on this map in red against all forest in gray. And historically, these were really rare occurrences. They did occur, there were large outbreaks in the 30s, but historically it's been really rare for mountain pine beetle to be in whitebark pine because those forests are outside of the climatic tolerance of the beetle. And so that was sort of the reason for why we decided to try and do this project, is to understand what is the role of climate in these outbreaks occurring in whitebark pine. And if we can understand the role of climate, can we then make future predictions about where and how severe those outbreaks might be? The mountain pine beetle spends most of its life cycle under the bark. It emerges in late July or early August, so the picture of the adult going to the eggs, that is late July and early August. And when the beetles bore through the bark and into the cambium, they also infect the tree with a blue stain fungus that can inhibit tree defenses, and it actually severs the xylem, which is what's thought to cause tree death. So trees try to fight back. They try and pitch the beetles out, literally with pitch, and they also try and wall off the area of attack. But if a tree is stressed, drought stress or old age or competition, then it's less able to overcome less able to overcome these attacks. So at low beetle populations, they rely on stressed trees to successfully attack and kill. But at high beetle populations, they actually go for healthy trees because they can overcome the tree defense. Then the eggs develop through the fall, and to December's right, they want to enter the winter in the last larval stage because it's the most cold tolerant stage. But even temperatures less than minus 40 degrees can completely kill the larvae in a tree. Then development ceases through the winter. It resumes again in the spring, and the pupae develop into adults to then emerge and start the life cycle over again. So the climate factors that are important here are drought stress in precipitation and temperature and climatic water deficit. Those are important in the fall when the beetles are attacking new trees. And for that mass attack to occur in late summer, early fall, requires what entomologists call adaptive seasonality. The beetle life cycle is strictly controlled by temperature. They don't have a dormant period in the summer, in the winter. If it's warm enough, their development continues. And so for the eggs to develop to the proper larval stage to overwinter in the last larval stage and emerge again as adults in late summer requires the right temperatures all year round. And winter mortality, another climatic factor driven by temperature, important obviously in the winter. So one of our primary goals was to understand how does climate influence outbreaks in whitebark pine. And we did this with statistical models, which I'll briefly describe. We modeled outbreaks as nonlinear functions of beetle pressure, or the number of trees killed last year, which is our estimate of the beetle population last year, the amount of remaining whitebark pine, which is the food source, and then a host of variables representing the effect of drought stress on trees, and the adaptive seasonality, temperature controls on adaptive seasonality, and winter mortality. The climate data were mostly from 800-meter prism data, but some were from process models, adaptive seasonality, and a cold tolerance model developed specifically for mountain pine beetle by others. Our outbreak data were from the Forest Service Aerial Detection Survey data, where each year observers in aircraft record the number of trees killed by mountain pine beetle among other mortality agents. For statistical reasons, we had to do this in a two-stage process. First, estimating the probability of an outbreak, and then, given that an outbreak occurred, what was the severity? We developed these models for 3 separate geographic regions across the range of whitebark: the Cascades, the Northern Rockies, and the Greater Yellowstone, both because there are differences in pine beetle genetics across this range, and because there are differences in the climates across these regions. And we didn't include California, although it's within the range of whitebark, because the aerial detection survey data there is just not good enough. So how good were the models we developed? These are the results from the model of probability of outbreak, and they show the area, total area with attacks in each year from 1998 through 2009. And the black line is the observed aerial detection survey data. The red is the predicted best model predicted for each region, and the red is the root mean square error, the error of the model. So they all, in all 3 regions, were really happy, and they did quite well in predicting the total area with outbreaks. Predicting outbreak severity is not quite as easy. The y-axis here is the total number of trees killed, and there's an enormous range. Our modeling unit was 1 kilometer grid cells. So you can have some with no trees killed, and you can have some with a whole lot of trees killed. So even though this was harder to do than the area with attacks, especially in the Greater Yellowstone, we're still pretty happy with how the model performed and less happy with how well it did in the Cascades. So what's driving these outbreaks? Next, I'll go through each of the explanatory variables that were of importance in at least one region and what their effect on outbreak probability. I'll use the results from the model of outbreak probability, although they're very similar in pattern, though not in magnitude for the severity outbreaks model. So all of these graphs will look relatively similar. It's the log odds, so how do the odds of an outbreak change as the explanatory variable changes? So here you can see that as beetle pressure measured in the number of trees killed last year, as that increases, the odds of an outbreak occurring increase until tapering off at high beetle pressure, which is probably they're eating themselves out of house and home. And these 2 variables were the second is remaining whitebark pine. What's their food source? As it declines, they have less food, there's less chance of an outbreak. These were the 2 most important variables in all of the 3 regions, and so to isolate the effects of climate, we had to include them in all the models, even though they're not the focus of what we are interested in. Drought stress was the most important variable in both the Cascades, most important climatic variable in both the Cascades and in the Northern Rockies. And here, drought stress is represented by precipitation. As precipitation increases, drought stress decreases, or as conversely, as precipitation decreases, drought stress increases. And this is the effect of drought stress at low beetle populations last year. What we expected, or were hoping that we would see, is that as drought stress increases, the odds of an outbreak increase. But you can see in the Greater Yellowstone, it's less important of a variable. Those dashed lines are the confidence intervals around that, and they're very wide, bounding 0 for much of its length. So why is that? Why should the Greater Yellowstone be different? Well, one explanation is there's less variability in precipitation in the greater Yellowstone. And if a tree is adapted to growing in consistently dry conditions, then decreasing precipitation may not have the same influence on growth and defensive capabilities as a tree that's adapted to growing in a more fluctuating moisture environment. It's also possible that it just didn't get dry enough in the summer. We computed several different variables representing drought stress, and summer precipitation was always the best variable. In the Cascades, it was the cumulative 4-year summer precip. In the Northern Rockies, the current summer, and in the greater Yellowstone, cumulative 2 summer precipitation. And maybe it just doesn't get dry enough there for it to be an important factor. Winter mortality was the next most important climatic factor in the Northern Rockies and the most important climatic factor in the greater Yellowstone. In the Northern Rockies, it was best represented by minimum winter temperature, and in the GYE by the probability of winter survival, which comes from a cold tolerance model developed specifically for the mountain pine beetle. As winters get warmer, there's a much greater chance of outbreak. Well, why wasn't it important in the Cascades? This is a look at the distribution of that probability of winter survival from the cold tolerance model. And values below 0.2 indicate places that are just not suitable for mountain pine beetle. They can't make it there. And so in the Cascades, it simply doesn't get cold enough for this to be having an influence. The variables representing adaptive seasonality, fall temperature that's controlling the development of eggs into larvae to begin the winter, and spring-summer temperatures, which control the development from pupa into adults for the next year. You can see these confidence intervals are really wide at either end. There's this range in the middle where it's pretty tight, and it seems to indicate that increasing temperature is decreasing the odds of an outbreak. And it's difficult to interpret this in relation to the other two regions because the patterns and the distributions of temperatures were really quite similar. So it may be that this is a genetic difference. Entomologists have found that when they take pine beetles from different geographic places, bring them into a laboratory setting, and expose them to the same temperature conditions, they have different development rates depending on where they were from. So that could be the reason it was only important in the greater Yellowstone. So drought was the most important climatic variable, the only important climatic variable in the Cascades, and most important in the Northern Rockies. And increasing drought stress, less precipitation, led to a greater chance of outbreak. Winter mortality was the controlling variable for the greater Yellowstone and second most in the Northern Rockies. Warmer winters lead to a greater chance of outbreaks, with adaptive seasonality having somewhat of an effect in the greater Yellowstone. What we want to do now is to move into to pastures quadrant, is to take these results and understanding, and we think the models are doing fairly well, and predict for future climate scenarios. What is the probability of outbreak, and what is the outbreak severity likely to be? So that then we can spatially, across this area, map where are the places that we can focus white bark pine restoration efforts. And particularly if we combine this with others who are working on mapping blister rust potential and just habitat suitability for white bark pine into the future, because they will get out competed by other species. It's not that they can't live lower, it's that other species will infringe and they're going to run out of room, up like pika moving off the top of the mountain. So that's where we're headed now, is to do these future predictions and work with people on the ground to hopefully help direct some restoration projects. We'd like to thank the Northwest Climate Science Center and the USGS Western Mountain Initiative for funding, and thanks to the many members of our Scientific Advisory Committee and to Ariane Meddens, and thank you for your attention.